just in the little bit that I've already begun meeting people here, I recognize that there's many people in the room who have far more experience than I. And so I want to approach this process, and I really think we all must, with a tremendous amount of humility and understand that we are all in a process of learning together about what is happening to our schools and what can be done to stop it or to change it, or to make the schools what we feel they should be, and to shape a different vision of the schools. So I'm going to say my thoughts, and then hopefully for not too long, and then I'm eager to hear what you have to say as well. I definitely want to have the right page on top. Okay, well, the first thing I want to say is that we can now dispense with the idea that all talk of an agenda of privatization is some kind of wild leftist conspiracy theory. Privatization, they don't want to privatize the schools, they're doing it. That is now happening in major American centers where public education, as we have come to know it and experience it, is literally ceasing to exist as we sit here. Philadelphia, Detroit, New Orleans. So that is the landscape in which we operate. Some of us were talking yesterday about, you know, in the olden days there would be a war. So you gather up your army and start, you know, making swords and get ready for the war. Then you march your army off to war. We are more like at war and trying to figure out how to make a sword in the middle of the war, trying to figure out how to build an army while fighting the battle, while they're coming over the wall, trying to figure out how to organize ourselves and organize a struggle to defend and improve public education. So no, it's not a conspiracy that's going on, although of course they do conspire. I think it's more correct to say that the country's elites, and arguably even global financial elites, have an emerging consensus that public education as an institution is out of line with their priorities for the economy as a whole, and it must be brought into line. It must be reorganized, restructured to more closely align with their priorities and where they want to take the economy and the world. And that is the big picture. Now, the little picture, do they of course disagree with each other? Are they all on the same page about every single part of this privatization, this reform of education? Absolutely not. We see them groping and grappling forward towards what their policy will be. We see parts of their policy blowing up in their face and becoming a complete embarrassment. But do they stop out of shame and embarrassment? No. They plow ahead and they figure out a way around the shame and embarrassment. Sometimes they backpedal away. Bill Gates, you know, maybe this testing thing has gone on. You know, maybe we've taken it a little too far. Oh, thank you, Bill Gates. Oh, you know, millions of dollars later, maybe the testing thing is gone a little too far. Maybe we need to pull back on that. So we see them groping toward what their policy will be, but never stopping in the overall attempt to reorganize and restructure education. I really think that it's all, that really you could sum up the whole thing as part, in terms of what is the priority, what is the overall plan and agenda. I think it's roughly could be described as austerity, roughly as trying to get us to make do with less and, crucially, accept that. To accept less as what we're due for just being a breathing human being in this country or on the planet. And really, much of what they've come up with is brilliant from their perspective as a way to get us to accept less and believe that we're getting more. It's genius, really. Think about funding. Funding for the schools. How are they going to reduce the actual budgets and the expenditures of the schools, but make us believe we're getting more money? They have come up with ways to do it. Notice how the extreme wave of municipal budget cuts that have swept across the country especially since the recession of 2008, coincides with the moving in of money that is linked to charity and to philanthropy. And so now it's more and more strengthened the hand of those who donate to the school and less about an actual underlying budget that's guaranteed year after year for the school. And instead of Bill Gates, he cares so much about education. He cares so much. That's why he's donating. Well, if he cares so much, then why not hand over the money to the public coffers and allow there to be a democratic discussion about what to do with it? Instead, he and his hirelings effectively set national education policy. And so the shift from budgeted money to money that either we dangle that you must compete for and or money that we donate, Zuckerberg, Walton family, Gates, you can name all of them, they effectively therefore control what goes on because it's their money that they're so generously handing over. Now I'm told that here you have a community, I think it's Beaverton, where Nike's moving in and was just allowed to become exempt from all kinds of taxes. But then we'll turn around and donate money to the school. Well, how generous of Nike. How big-hearted of them. They really care, you see. Well, that is part of it. I mean, in New York City, you know, we had this thing where the race to the top money, there's all kinds of money that is supposed to be ours and that has become ours, but that we never actually see in the classroom. And so race to the top money has gone to all kinds of things. So they beat you up and say, well, why won't you do this? And why won't you change your union rules so that you can have race to the top money? But then that doesn't mean that you're going to see it in your classroom. In New York City, that money, millions and millions of dollars, has gone to merit pay schemes, to data analysts, to all kinds of the development of all kinds of convoluted schemes of teacher evaluation. Isn't it funny how in this time of economic austerity, when there is no money to raise class sizes, what are they in Beaverton, 60 kids in some class? I mean, ridiculous class sizes. There's no money to lower class sizes, but when it comes to teacher evaluation, no amount of money is too large. When it comes to Pearson, no amount of money is too large. By 2015, Texas will have given them over $1 billion. Do you know how much they've cut from arts and sciences in Texas? And yet they have $1 billion to give Pearson for tests? So this is it's a brilliant way to actually, in some cases, actually spend more money. No doubt, actually spend more money, but not on us, not on teaching and learning, not on children, but on schemes of privatization and greater control of the schools and of teachers, and crucially on union busting. But it's a brilliant policy of dangling the money, all the largesse of philanthropy, of making us believe we're getting more money for the schools when actually it's about giving us less and increasingly ceding control to them. I would argue that what we've seen with testing, as I just mentioned, is another part of this. That the whole craze around standardized testing that we've now experienced for over a decade is similarly a brilliant scheme to make us believe that they are hell-bent on raising quality when actually it is lowering the quality of education in our schools. Of course, and as we all know, I'm not telling you something you don't know, that, of course, the overwhelming pressure to raise high-stakes standardized test scores is going to narrow teaching and learning. And that's what I mean by, therefore, giving you less. Of course, it's going to narrow it to the subjects taught. But they have an answer for that, too, that we've seen in New York. They have an answer to that. We've said all along, well, now all the schools are just doing reading and math, reading and math, reading and math. Their answer is, well, then we'll come up with more tests. I have a friend who's an elementary school music teacher. She has a wonderful guitar program in her school, right? Well, they called her in one summer to help them develop the new high-stakes standardized math assessment that we all know is primarily a way to assess her as a music teacher, right? So nobody has to actually go, I don't know, it's just a crazy thought, go hear her students play guitar, right? But someone is going to be able to sit behind a screen somewhere and behind a laptop somewhere looking at a spreadsheet and evaluate whether or not she is a good or bad math teacher based on a bubble test that her students will take at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year about playing the guitar. That will be a way, it's in some ways most boggling to the mind when you think about the arts, but I think that similar kind of thing applies actually to more subjects. That it's not just what is taught is narrowed down to reading and math, but it's that even within each subject, even if they did high-stakes standardized tests for every single thing that is taught, That within that subject, it boils down the education to the flattest, most reducible elements of it, to the most easily quantifiable parts of it, and therefore robs us potentially of the richness of what teaching and learning should be. Let me tell you a story. Last year, I was teaching 4th grade in Brooklyn, and we administered the 4th grade state standardized test. And on the day of the listening portion, we gathered in a room to look at it for a few minutes before we had to go read it so that we could read it and emphasize, all the things we were going to need to do to try to help the kids do their best on the test without cheating. And so we're looking over the test, and the principal is in the room, and there's this, it was a very weird story. I'm not going to lie to you. It was a very strange story. But at the end of it, at the end of reading over the thing and looking at the problems, the questions, we, 4 or 5 professional educators, could not decide what we thought the correct answers were. And it was like the clock is ticking, we have to go administer this thing, and we don't know. So then we started debating it. We started arguing. We started using evidence from the text and arguing our perspectives. No, I'm serious. It's like, because we were trying to convince each other, no, it's this. Like, I'm telling you, it's this. And so, in some ways, it became a very interesting discussion. And then at one point, somebody said, well, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if we could have this discussion with the students? Wouldn't that be great? So in a few minutes, what was about to happen was that 9-year-olds were going to take this test to determine whether or not I was a good teacher or a bad teacher, whether or not their school would stay open or close, whether or not their principal would be allowed to stay in her job, whether or not they would go on to the 5th grade. 9-year-olds. So my colleagues essentially became of the mind that this was a horrible passage and they hated it and all of that. I actually had a little bit of a different interpretation. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what, I like this story. I actually like this story. It was a crazy story. I'm not going to tell it to you. But I liked that it was so quirky and strange and weird and made you think that it was worth reading and worth discussing and kind of stayed with you. And what is the point of that story? I'm not sure. I like that story. But that's the kind of story it's not fair to give a 9-year-old a high-stakes test on and determine all of those things based on it. But then they have an answer for that too. Problem solved, Brian. We'll make it more fair by making it a flatter story. A more boring story, a story with a more clear and straightforward meaning. With what is true and not true about it is very straightforward and easily reducible. So I feel like there's no way, when you enter into these dilemmas, there's no solution except to remove the high stakes, the whole exercise of high stakes standardized testing. Because I'm literally preaching to the choir at the church. Can everyone turn to your hymnals? Oh Lord, we hate these tests. 479. Oh Lord, how we hate the test. No, I'm just kidding. No, really, I mean, what is the choice there? Either the choice is that we're going to give kids really rich literature that is not easily reducible to correct answers, that is genuinely open to multiple interpretations, in which case it's not fair to do the high-stakes exercise. Or we're going to give them the flat, stale material, in which case it's not worth their time. Or our time, and in which case we don't want to send the message that that is literature, or that this whole exercise we're going through is real teaching and learning. Either way, the whole thing is doomed. And so that's just, I think how we have to look at it. Okay. Yes. Now I say all this, and I think there's another thing that we have to recognize, which we discovered in the course of trying to organize, to try to find creative ways to challenge these tests, and that was that not all parents saw it that way. And who saw it that way and who didn't fell on very interesting lines. Increasingly, as we raised the kind of arguments that I was raising just now, the parents who came forward to most vehemently challenge the tests on that basis, these tests are crushing my child's creativity, wasting their time, this kind of thing, increasingly we saw it was a pattern that these were white middle-class parents, overwhelmingly. And that, in general, and again, this is just a generalization, but a pattern that was unmistakable. And you can speak about, what the pattern is here, but this was the pattern we saw in New York. And in general, the more working class parents, parents of color, saw it differently. Overwhelmingly, what we heard when we started talking more and more to parents about this is that they saw the test as a chance, as a measure of fairness. For example, in New York, one of the ways many families have pulled themselves out of poverty or out of a lower economic bracket was getting those good public sector jobs. Becoming a bus driver, where you have a guaranteed wage scale, guaranteed pension, guaranteed health benefits. How do you become a bus driver? You pass a test. And so they turn to their kids and they're like, yeah, you better learn how to pass that test. And actually, you can do as well as anybody else on that test. And it's almost like a feeling of empowerment and confidence in your child. And so I think that I know that in New York, this is something that we're grappling with because many of us have these very strong beliefs about these tests. We're completely opposed to them, and yet parents who we want to organize alongside have a different view. How do we address that? Well, I was speaking to Sean Barrett, a teacher and activist in Chicago, in the Chicago Teachers Union, and he said to me that they've run up against this kind of a dynamic many times, and that essentially what they try to do is deepen the conversation. That is, that rather than just harangue the parent or lecture the parent about the evils of testing, that there's a whole process of genuine listening and dialogue that has to go on, where you might ask the parent, for example, well, why do you want your kid to pass the test? Why do you think the test is so important? What is it that you want for your kid beyond the test? What is it you want for your kid in life? And let's have a conversation together about what it is that we are trying to do for our children. Ultimately, I do believe that we have to challenge the logic of high-stakes standardized testing, but I think we have to figure out a way to bring along growing numbers of people along with us. And if we find that there is such a stark racial or economic or both dynamic to who is challenging the tests across the board, as we have seen in New York, then that is something that we have to reflect on, and that is ultimately got to become a priority for us in figuring out how to move forward in those discussions. But I think that we cannot move forward without dealing with those challenges. I want to say a little bit more about that in a minute, or maybe right now, because that's why I have notes. Because a similar dynamic occurred with our struggle with charter schools. And here, the process of that kind of a constructive dialogue between people who at first don't see something the same way has gone a lot further, and I feel like holds out a certain hope for our movement in the future. Notice, for example, that in the film, The Inconvenient Truth Behind Waiting for Superman, if you've seen it, or even if you haven't, go see it, that almost every single parent who appears in that film is a charter school parent or a former charter school parent, almost every single one. And isn't that interesting? Because there was a dynamic in New York where in the very first instance, the charter school organizers, with all of their money from Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, you name it, came forward and went first to the most oppressed communities, communities who had experienced discrimination of many forms in our public schools, who felt that they had been underserved. And they promised them justice. We're going to get you racial justice. And unfortunately, many people in those communities had an ear for that argument and felt that the union, again, unfortunately, this is a very painful thing. It's like, this is what I experienced as a teacher in Harlem, did not feel that my union was their natural ally, felt that my union had a history of being indifferent to their struggle and to their concerns and to their oppression. And so we found ourselves in a circumstance where they were whipping up parents to call for the blood of the union. And we made a strategic decision from the beginning. We were under enormous pressure to say, many people told us, you cannot say that you're against charter schools because so many parents of color, so many African American parents are for charter schools, therefore you cannot say that. You'll get nowhere. We decided to play it differently. Here's what we did. We said, and when I say we, I mean the kind of general activist community, people I collaborate with. At the time, it was a formation called the Grassroots Education Movement. we decided to say, look, we believe that we're right about these charter schools, so we're not going to water down that position at all. We're going to hold to that position. However, we are going to speak differently to charter school parents and to charter school students and to charter school teachers than we would to charter school CEOs. Because we recognize that a charter school parent is doing what they're supposed to do. That is, they're trying to get the very best education for their child. That is totally different than a charter school CEO paying themselves $500,000 to oversee a few hundred children who is trying to spread their franchise and, frankly, has an agenda of privatization of the schools. It's totally different people. And actually, the parents are not our enemy, even when sometimes it feels like that and we're clashing. So we literally had a situation, and the film came about at a moment where this was shifting so dramatically in our favor, where people who had literally been on the opposite side of like a public hearing yelling at us came over and were yelling with us. And and that's why they're in the film. That's why they would come to us and say, sure, I'll be in your film. Because through they know who we were. We weren't hiding who we were. And that's why I think the importance of being upfront with what our actual position was and not changing that. Because what they came to see through their own experience in the charter schools was, one, that they didn't live up to their promises, and two, that they actually reproduced more forms of discrimination and oppression and hierarchy and all these kinds of things. Of course, we know the schools are notorious for pushing out the highest needs students, for students who are the most challenging or most expensive to educate, all of this kind of thing. We've seen in the places where they have gotten their way the most, I mean they, the privatizers, like New Orleans, where they got their way. They've gotten everything that they wanted. What do the schools look like in New Orleans? Well, it's back as they themselves grudgingly admit. Excuse me. I don't know if you follow the writing of Paul Tough. Personally, I find he's not my favorite, let's just put it that way. But even Paul Tough, who's been a champion of privatization from the beginning, over and over again, admits that they have reproduced a system of extreme inequality and stratification, racial and economic. At the bottom, you have the public school systems are literally a repository of the students who could not get it together to get themselves into some other kind of school, including special needs students, darker skinned students, overwhelmingly lower income. And as you move up the scale of increasingly selective charter schools, the complexion of the students becomes paler and their incomes increase. And the people who run the system in New Orleans explicitly say, our job is not to be like pedagogical leaders of teaching and learning, God forbid. Our job is to oversee portfolios of schools and to bring online private operators and just select and deselect. Select the best ones, deselect, close down the worst ones. And through this competition of changing portfolios of schools, we'll eventually get all great schools, of course. Let the free market do its thing. And of course, we've seen the opposite. So through their experience, they came over to our side. I think that there's a lesson for us in that we have to figure out a way when we are fighting these battles to overcome deep, long-standing racial divisions, which sometimes our organizations have been implicated in. Yes, that's right. Sometimes our organizations have been, at best, passive in the face of all of this privatization, and at worst, complicit. And that is part of the problem. If the privatizers, Eva Moskowitz, and people, you don't know her, sorry, she operates a chain of charter schools and pays herself way more than the chancellor. She completely wraps herself in the robes of the civil rights movement, thumps her chest about racial justice. And if she finds an audience, then we have to reflect on that. Because the real civil rights movement, of course we understand, was a movement that was intimately bound up in the struggle for economic justice and the struggle for unionization. Dr. King died fighting for public sector workers in Memphis, trying to organize a union. King said that the enemies of the Negro are the enemies of labor, that they're one and the same. That a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and that justice is indivisible. We have to say the same thing, that you cannot get racial justice for for students by beating up on adults. That the fate of students is bound up with that of adults. It's all revealed when you look at who's really behind this thing. I mean, Walmart is going to be a delivery system for economic justice. The Walton family, the owners of Walmart, are deeply implicated in privatization and in charter schools. Well, how do they treat adults? Aren't the students, Walmart cares so much about the students, but won't they one day grow up to be working adults? And what kind of conditions will they work in? Why is it that Walmart has this obsession with children and cares nothing for adults? Well, you know, they're working adults working at Walmart. They can be working nearly full-time hours and be below the poverty line and eligible for public assistance. And so we have to see that we have to agree with King that justice is indivisible, but we have to bring that back. I think we have to go back to the best traditions of the trade union movement at a time when it took up the question of racial justice and frankly take that sword out of their hands and make it a sword in our hands. So that parents know instinctively that if there's a complaint, if there's a struggle, if they want something changed, that of course the people they're going to go to are the teachers. And of course the teachers are probably, if the teachers don't agree with them, the teachers will listen to them, will hear them. I was recently rereading Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, in part because the AFT just published a hit piece on it. I don't know if you saw this in the magazine. It's outrageous. The latest issue of the AFT newspaper has an 8-page hit on Howard Zinn and on his cred, his chops as a historian. Well, as I was reading the book, I came upon this passage in the very opening pages where he says, look, I'm taking this stance, the stance of the poor, the stance of the oppressed. I understand that that doesn't mean that poor people, working people are always better in every case than, they're not better people, they're not more noble. You know, I don't want to romanticize people. Right. And he says, I remember a quote. He doesn't attribute it. He just says, I remember this quote that somebody said once. The cry of the poor is not always just. But if you don't listen to it, you won't know what justice is. And I feel like that is the approach that we have to have. The cry of parents is not always just. But if we don't listen to it, how can we claim to be fighting on the side of justice? Similarly, the cry of teachers is not always just. But if we don't listen to that too, how can we be fighting for justice? I was thinking about that when I heard that there's a curriculum thing coming up that I'm hoping we can discuss, courageous conversations. Okay. No, but listen, I'll be honest with you, and I don't know what to think of it. I'm not, you know, you have experience with it. On the one hand, I see that of course there's a dynamic where when you have such a disparity between who is a teacher and who is a student overwhelmingly, that there can be a consciousness gap and a lack of awareness about what students are actually going through. And a challenge a challenge in that social gap. I get that, absolutely. And a need for explicit anti-racist training. On the other hand, in a context where there's an all-out war on teachers and their unions, I could also imagine that such a thing could be yet another way, another club to beat teachers over the head and make them the problem. See, you're the problem because you don't get the students, kind of thing. And so the cry of teachers in that situation, maybe they're not right in every case, I don't know. But there's something about the fact that teachers are crying out about something like that that also has to be listened to. There is another dynamic. I heard that Michelle Alexander's coming here soon to speak. I hope you all go to hear her. Because she makes an argument in her book, and if you haven't read it, you absolutely must. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. She makes an argument that in many ways, the kind of so-called official colorblindness of our society is the new racism. And that behind that official stance of colorblindness, nearly all of our institutions as a society actually do discriminate against people of color, and especially African Americans, in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that increasingly people like her and others are talking about is the way that that criminalization process has seeped into our schools and become, through zero tolerance and suspensions, a very serious problem, and especially for African American students in the schools. So then what's our attitude going to be to that? And historically, teacher unions have taken a stance of more suspensions, tougher suspensions, on the guise of, well, that is about protecting the authority of the teacher. But I would argue that we are at a moment where that kind of approach is absolutely death for us. is death. That we have to figure out a way to take a stance for the students who are the most marginalized right now, who are being criminalized, and try to figure out a way to say that the conditions of teaching and learning that they are imposing on us is what is causing the problems in the classroom. That they have imposed on us class sizes, curriculum, demands of testing that are entirely impossible, and then try to blame us and pit us against each other. But we cannot get out of that with a bunker mentality of just defending ourselves. I'm speaking as an educator. I think we have to take a stronger anti-racist stance. The place where we've seen that play out, and the reason I say this, I'm saying this not as like a moral imperative, although you could argue that. I'm not even saying it as an ideological, shibboleth or something. Although I am somebody who is a radical. If you didn't already know. It's true. Full disclosure. But I really believe that right now, this question of racism and what's happening to students of color in our schools is a strategic imperative for us to address, a matter of life and death for the struggle for public education, because they have figured out that this is a wedge that they can use to destroy the whole thing. We have to get smart and figure out that it's in our interests to fight alongside the parents and alongside the students and in advocating for our most troubled students in a way that brings those constituencies along with us in the fight to defend public education. Because I'm sure you would agree, we don't want to defend it just as it is. We want to defend the public nature of it and then fight for something much more. Fight for real reform. I think we've seen this dynamic at play most dramatically in the Chicago Teachers Union strike. It's a dynamic that's not lost on most places I go. People get this. People get that somehow they worked day in and day out for years in advance to build a genuine grassroots solidarity so that parents knew instinctively that the union had their back. And that meant some real courageous conversations, little c, not trademarked. But like, for example, again, I was talking to Sean Barrett, and he said, well, we brought parents into our union caucus, to the core. We brought them into the caucus and sat down with them and said, what are your needs? What are your priorities? They helped to set the agenda of our union caucus. And some teachers pushed back against that and said, whoa, isn't that giving the parents way too much power? And they answered, yes. Yes, it is. And we saw that they reaped the reward of that, because when they were out walking the picket line, overwhelmingly people who had their kids in the public schools supported them in that strike. They boldly said, they called their employer's school system an apartheid system. That was their word, which might be a shocking and very extreme word for some people, but for people who live in an apartheid school system and work in it and experience it, parents and families who experience it, it was common sense, like finally somebody's saying that. Now, if we don't say that, we know that the privatizers will. They will come out and say the very same thing and promise that they are going to deliver racial justice. We know that they're not, and so we have to figure out a way to take that sword out of their hand and to fight. I just want to say one last thing, which is that, or a couple last things. That's what notes are for. I think that I'm very proud to be a part of a caucus in New York that is trying to change this dynamic inside our union. We're called the, CORE is the Caucus of Rank and File Educators. In a thinly veiled copycat attempt, we called our caucus the Movement of Rank and File Educators. More. And our slogan is that our working conditions are our students' learning conditions. And that is the message that we want to give to not only teachers, but to parents and community. And just like the Chicago Teachers Union said that there's no way they're going to win this just as a union battle between employer and workers, but they had to make it a city-wide struggle, so too many of us in the movement of rank and file educators believe that this is about a fight for public education, a fight that many people care about, not just a union question in the most narrow sense. What are we really fighting for? Well, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that. I believe that we're fighting for schools that are humane places where kids can have small class sizes and leisurely discussions about all kinds of things, including things that they want to talk about, where they and their parents and we together can have real control over what is explored and discovered and learned. I think kids need a rich curriculum. I think we need a curriculum that far exceeds what in many schools is so narrow and so stripped down. And crucially, I think people need the opportunity to explore their own histories, identities, and yes, languages, and have the opportunity to learn about themselves and their world from their own perspectives and from the perspectives of other people. And crucially, I think that it has to remain a public system. As we've seen, the more we move towards a privatized system, the more competition, profit, corruption, and everything that comes with that is introduced. We just had this debate about healthcare. And as we see the problems of a privatized healthcare system, so too we are increasingly seeing the problems of a privatized school system. Do we need accountability? Yes, absolutely. Of course we need accountability. Of course. But we should be accountable to our students and to the families that we're serving, not to corporate millionaires or to bureaucrats sitting behind computer screens.